Yeah, well, I'm Will Rawling. I'm part of a W. Rawling and Son farming business with my wife Louise and my son Sam and his partner Lizzie. We're currently on Farthwaite Farm, which is a place that we've added to the business over the last 20 years. This place is actually on Kinnyside. It's between Ennerdale and Wasdale valleys, and the land behind me that we're looking at is all common land. We've got a little farm up here where I actually live that relies on all this common land behind us. So very much a traditional hill farm up here, which is a kind of a satellite of the larger farming business which exists in the Ennerdale Valley. Lake District Hill Farm, it's within the Lake District National Park, only just, right on the boundary. Farmed along traditional lines, keeping herdwick sheep, the traditional Lakeland breed. Farmed very close to nature. The sheep live on the fell, come inside, down into these fields for mating in the back end, and down again in April time for lambing. But really they live most of the time out on the fell, and that really makes best use of the natural attributes of the herdwick, which is a very hardy breed, and it also relies on its really strong territorial nature, its hefting ability that allows us to keep sheep on these vast areas of open fell land without any physical boundaries between them. It's a system that's existed in the Lake District. It evolved in the Lake District way back around the time of the Viking settlements, when the Vikings first started settling in these areas, and so they've been around a long time. I haven't been here that long, but the family's been involved in farming in the Ennerdale Valley, not up here particularly, but in the Ennerdale Valley the family's been farming for around 500 years on the site where my son lives. I guess we're as territorially fixed as our sheep to some extent. Yeah. We bought this farm up here about 40 years ago with a flock of hefty sheep. So the bloodlines up here have been kept separate from the ones at the Hollins. So we've kept the original bloodline up here as well, which will have gone back probably as far, because even though ownership might have changed, the sheep, because they're hefted, because the sheep are basically attached to the farms, you can't put new sheep onto these farms because they don't know where home is. They've got to understand where their territory is. They've got to know their heft. So although the people might change, the sheep remain on the same farm all the time. So the sheep are very much part of the farm. They're as much part of the farm as the grass. People change, the sheep don't. The sheep bloodlines on this place will go back since the flocks were originally established. Yeah. The area behind me is Kinnyside Common. Very, very rural sort of part of the Lake District National Park, but the Sellafield nuclear plant is actually only 2.5 miles west of us, down towards the sea. Yeah, so we've got some of the most modern technology, cheek by cheek with some of the most ancient farming systems that exist probably in the British Isles. Yeah. Chernobyl, obviously a massive incident in world history. Most of us, all of us, in fact, were completely unaware that Chernobyl had actually exploded. When the Chernobyl cloud came over, the advice was to stay indoors. The less you're exposed to it, obviously the better. But in our situation, we were lambing sheep and sheep needed attention. That was our main priority, so we didn't stop indoors. It was a bit of a shock, I must admit. It was a bit scary. Louise and myself, we're just sort of getting ourselves established on this place up here, away from the main farm down at the Hollins. We had young children, and obviously we didn't want any adverse effect on them. But realistically, we had to get on with what we were doing, and there wasn't a lot we could do about it. So we were all out and about in the fields with our livestock. The weather wasn't particularly good. It was pouring down at the time. And it was only in the evening when we came in and watched the BBC News that we realised we'd actually been working under a cloud of nuclear fallout for certainly all of that day and possibly some of the previous day, which came as a bit of a shock. To some extent we were conditioned to the effects of nuclear accidents because we live very close to the Sellafield nuclear facility, and our parents had experienced something similar that was by no means as serious in the 50s. I think it was 57. That at the time was going to be the end of the world, and actually all it meant was that they had to change their way of farming for about 3 days or something, and then they were allowed to get back to normal. But Chernobyl was slightly different. The radiation cloud that did come over the Lake District hung about a while. The rain actually helped the radiation down onto the fields, onto the fells and the fields, onto the livestock, onto us, and we suffered the annoyance. We didn't suffer any real serious problems from a health point of view at all that I know of. We were then basically restricted and we couldn't move any livestock until we'd had them tested, and it took quite a while to get a system in place that allowed sheep to be tested post pre-movement, and basically they came and read the radiation levels in them using a Geiger counter. The isotope that came out of Chernobyl was supposedly different to the one in Sellafield, but we always felt it was a tremendous coincidence that one of the areas that was worst affected was in the area in the hinterland of Sellafield. The scientists insisted it had absolutely nothing to do with Sellafield, but I'm sure there were levels of background radiation here already that Chernobyl simply tipped over the point of balance, I think. And the areas that were affected were in Britain were around areas where there were nuclear facilities, so Sellafield in Cumbria, Wilfer Power Station and Anglesey. There was an area in North Wales and on Anglesey where they were closed down, and surprisingly 500 miles away around Dounreay, right on the north of Scotland. So, you know, anecdotally it would suggest that there was certainly some effect from the fact that there was a nuclear facility somewhere in the area to start with. But the Lake District was particularly badly hit by Chernobyl. We were under restriction for 5 or 6 years, whereby we had to, before we could sell any sheep off the farm, we had to have them tested. They had to come below a certain threshold of below a certain level of becquerels within the meat on the sheep, and that was simply the question of putting a Geiger counter on the muscle of the sheep, and it recorded how much radiation was actually stored in that muscle. In most cases, there wasn't a real problem. There was a lot of activity, obviously, locally, because we had all the nuclear boffins on our doorstep, so they were all getting very involved in things. One of our neighbours up here was asked if he could provide the scientists with the sheep so they could slaughter it and take some of the meat away for testing, which they did. They slaughtered the sheep on farm, took a leg off it, I think, and took that away for testing. Within about 5 hours, the next morning, John, the guy who provided the sheep, got a very urgent phone call telling him not to go anywhere near the sheep and to dispose of it sensibly and not do anything else with it, much to John's amazement, because he'd actually eaten some of it for his supper the previous evening. But John went on to live a quite healthy and active life for a number of years afterwards. He is dead now, but I think it was old age rather than nuclear poisoning that got John. Louise and myself thought, is this the end of it all? Is this going to mean that the Lake District and our farming systems, our whole way of life is going to be effectively put on hold, maybe stopped entirely? Does this mean that our land has become impossible to farm? And we actually got details about emigrating to New Zealand. Fortunately, the consequences were a lot less serious than any of us thought they might be. We all hoped that it would blow over, which it did. It'd be better if it hadn't blown over, but anyway, it did blow over. And after 5 or 6 years of this post-movement, pre-movement testing of sheep before they went to market, we slowly got back into a routine that allowed us to carry on farming the way that we always had done, really. We learned a few lessons, a few sort of very basic lessons about how radiation works. We very quickly discovered that if we tested sheep close to any of our granite walls, they were going to record higher levels of radiation than they would if we moved them away from the granite. I think everyone knows that granite has quite a high levels of radiation in it anyway, which might be one of the reasons that the Lake District was badly affected. We also learned that if we tested sheep that had been grazing grass on peat-based soils, immediately they came off those peat-based soils, they would be likely to fail the Becquerel test. If we put them onto clay-based soils for a week or 10 days before we actually tested them, they would pass. You know, the fact that they'd been tested actually encouraged us to try and market this product as being tested nuclear-free. Didn't make any difference to the value of it, but we were confident that the product we were presenting to the public was safe enough to eat because it had actually been tested, whereas much of the other stuff that was coming into the country from all over the world wouldn't be. I would imagine the soils around here do have higher levels of radiation in them than you would find in areas where there hasn't been contamination. But, you know, you've got to remember, as we mentioned, we've got high levels of natural radiation in the granite. We've got Sellafield 2.5 miles down the road, and we've got the legacy of what came across from Chernobyl some 40 odd years ago now. We've all grown up in an area where nuclear has been, you know, part of our lives. Sellafield has been there right through my lifetime and through the lifetime of pretty much everyone else that's grown up in this area. I wouldn't say we're kind of happy with the situation that we've got Sellafield on our doorstep, but we're conditioned to it. We understand it's there. It generates a lot of employment. It provides a service, a facility for the rest of the world effectively, because it reprocesses the world's radioactive waste. It's basically the world's radioactive dustbin. Yeah, I would prefer it wasn't there, but it is there, and so I'm not going to worry too much about it. Sellafield has done to our communities on this western edge of the Lake District National Park what tourism has done to communities within the centre of the lakes. It's changed the way that those communities operate. So house prices are obviously in these what are effectively dormitories of Sellafield, these little rural villages in and around the site. House prices are inflated. Younger people find it very difficult that have grown up in the villages find it very difficult to stop there. They've got to go and live somewhere else. They're not necessarily the rural communities that we'd expect to find and that you would have found 30, 40 years ago, where most of the people that lived in the village would be working within that community. Everybody knew each other. The tasks that people were involved with would complement each other. You know, people who were working in farming, quarrying, forestry, mostly rural-based stuff. Very kind of pastoral, very kind of with nature, if you would. Now I would suggest that the majority of people who live in those rural communities are working at Sellafield or have retired having worked at Sellafield for much of their life. But, you know, keeps the pub open, keeps the school open, keeps the village shop open. Didn't actually, the village shop closed, but we've got another one. But it's a community, but a different community. It's not your typical rural community as people would sort of envisage it, you know. Is nuclear a sensible option for safe, for clean energy and climate change? Some would say yes, if we could be confident that it was safe. The nuclear waste that is stored at Sellafield is going to be a dangerous commodity for millions of years, probably, certainly thousands of years. Energy, people need energy. We live in the Lake District, it's full of water. I don't think they've really explored the development of sensitive hydro plants. I don't think they've really looked at that particularly well. Personally, I would prefer to see energy generated from natural sources. But Sellafield's there. I think realistically, if we believe what we're told by the guys who work there, it doesn't actually doesn't contribute an awful lot to the national grid. It generates enough energy to support itself in its main role as being a nuclear waste processing facility. That rather contradicts the whole point of it being there in many respects. So no, to answer the question, no, I don't think Sellafield is part of the future. Possibly a more refined form, a more controlled form of nuclear energy generation might be, but shipping nuclear waste from all over the world into Sellafield does not inspire me with a great deal of confidence. I would much prefer it didn't happen. But we've got to get energy. We've got to get energy from somewhere. I'm sure there are many forms of renewable energy that we should be exploring before we start introducing stuff that's going to be with us and leave a legacy for many generations to come.
Invisible between fells and sea. Are we in the middle of nowhere here, where the March mist settles, then passes as sun seeps in? A butterfly tests its wings, curlews weave their call into wind, and the beck, freed from fell-deep earth, flows silk-smooth, shimmers through a shadowed land. A little to the south is George's place, and in the next valley, where clouds ride dark hills, is Michael. These farms are jewels threaded by time, bloodlines, and the knowing of land, where hefts are linked and the wide open space is home. From this farm gate, in one sweep of the eye, thousands of hectares ready to green with this year's spring. Calder Beck, Kinneside, the heights of Ennerdale. Further, there's Wasdale, and above it all, Scafell, marbled with winter's stubborn snow. Looking the other way, with our backs to the fells, there's the Irish Sea, the shine of water under sun so intense it's piercing. We blink, adjust our eyes to the bright sea and the black towers of the radioactive dustbin that no one wants on their doorstep. But here it is, and here we are, ignoring it. You can't wake up every day thinking about radiation, what the sky brings, what blows over, what could happen.